Hello, I'm Greg Farrar. It is April 30th, 2020, and this is my almost daily COVID-19 trend analysis live stream. Trying a slightly different location here. I keep moving around. Hopefully y'all can hear me today. Yesterday had some audio troubles for a good portion of it. I had to start over, which was not fun. But I do appreciate if there are any problems, technical problems, drop me a chat line. Here in the window, I usually can see it.
Hello, I'm Greg Farrar.
Yeah, okay, here I'm talking to myself again through my own speaker. Great. Okay, so I'll cover the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California in 3 segments. The focus here, as always, is really on, well, where are we going? It's on prediction. I tend to focus on short term. I'm not really trying to say what's going to happen in a month. There are models that try to do that, and they're wrong, I think, almost always, but even so, they're better than I could do. I just think that looking a month ahead is pretty wild, but it's going to be hard to ever say that. Too many things change, and there are too many things we don't know. But what I can often do is say what direction things are headed in, and say things like, if the trend for Ohio continues, then we're going to see a continued reduction in new cases day over day, which is true, by the way. So, starting with the countries. United States, as always, leading in total cases. I'm going to switch right over to the per capita, because I think that's where it's going to immediately fail on me. Let's see if this one will do it. If not, I'm going to reload. I always have this, not always. I sometimes have this problem. I think that maybe it happens when I leave these tabs sitting for too long. If they sit long enough, they kind of lose their mojo. So, while that's reloading, I'll just switch right over to the states. I'll be back to the countries in a moment. State of New York, as always, by far and away the leader. New Jersey in total cases, easily second place. But when we look at the states by new cases, we see this trend upwards, peaking downwards, and we see that in New York and New Jersey, but especially in New York. And so New York continues to look very good. New York has clearly turned the corner around April 5th and has been heading downward ever since. Let's see how our countries are looking and whether they'll let me zoom. I was on the per capita graph. One of these is a way outlier. Let's see who that is. Singapore. Okay, well, Singapore comes and goes. There has been a lot of talk about how Singapore, after, as I recall, a very good start to it, has lost its grip and is heading towards epidemic. Certainly, this is very strongly indicating that. This is not the rope chart indicating growth rate, which is something that can swing a lot. This is the total number of new cases per million. And so this is a really significant number that Singapore has twice as many cases per million on average, according to its trend line. Now, its cases are relatively small, which is why it's number 25, but it's a relatively small country, and so per capita, it's doing what we saw with Rhode Island, for instance, where you can be small and you can still completely dominate the graph per capita if you have a relatively large number of cases. So Singapore, if when you look closely, you see the last few days have been better, sort of trending downward. Last 5 days even, but it had a long trend upwards before that. I can imagine it might be turning around and heading downward. We'll see what the rope chart thinks about that. But in fact, let's just look at the rope chart for a minute now and see what the rope chart thinks about Singapore. If I zoom in on the rope chart, we'll go back to that other graph in a minute, but let's just look at Singapore. I bet you rope chart says it's trending downward. Yeah, okay. Singapore has got this very dramatic swoop here. As we often see for the small ones, their data is noisier because there are fewer cases, and so they do these wild things that are out of the main rope. So yeah, Singapore peaked. It has been very bad, but it's been recovering. It actually crossed zero, well, it peaked in its growth, in the change of its growth rate. The real peak, the one that we typically talk about, is right here where it crosses zero, turning the corner, and that's where its growth rate starts to drop. But that happened just 4 days ago, 3 days ago, and so though Singapore's growth in new cases does seem to be dropping, as we saw from these data points here, it's only just started to happen, and so it's going to be a while before it drops below the other countries. Or maybe not that long, because you can see even 2 days ago, it was only barely in first place. Ireland, which also was leading in per capita for a while, also has peaked and is heading downward. Belgium, long ago, peaked and heading downward. The United States is in third place here, but also has peaked and is heading downward. The ones that aren't, Singapore, I think the trend line hasn't quite gotten the memo here, but we can see again from this line that the fact that this is below zero suggests that this really did, and in some sense should have, flattened out and headed back down here. And it will do that. We see this happen. It's just that these trend lines are a little slower to accept that there's been a change in the trend than the ones we see on the rope chart. So the United States then peaked in dropping. Singapore also probably peaked in dropping. We'll look at Peru, though. This is one that's fairly high in per capita cases and rising, and it hasn't peaked here. Sweden, fairly high and rising. Let's take a look at those on the rope chart. Looking at just Peru. So if I blink Peru on this chart here, you can see that it's in third place. It's third worst in terms of its growth rate day over day. It does have a positive growth rate. Most countries don't. Most of them are shrinking. But Peru has a positive growth rate around 6%. And it's about steady at 6%, so that could be worse for sure. We've sometimes seen lines in this graph sharply upward. We often see that, even, for instance, Singapore was like that just a couple weeks ago. But Peru is only very barely upward, if at all. And then there's Sweden, similarly, barely above zero in its growth rate. It's growing at about 1% a day, but it's also stable at that number. That 1% is not rising, and 1% isn't falling and heading towards zero and then negative growth. It's stable. So those are some of our worst spots right now: Peru and Sweden. And Sweden is always in the news because it really has taken a different approach. It's gone and never really locked down, let people eat in restaurants, let elementary schools continue. There are a lot of things they've done that are problematic, maybe, in terms of quickly overcoming the epidemic, which is to say they're focusing on things other than simply reducing or eliminating or reducing the number of cases and deaths. That's not their sole focus. They're trying to do a different balance. And we can see the balance is doing about what you'd expect. They're not having the recovery that most countries are having, but it's not running away either. So Sweden may be exactly where they want to be. Saudi Arabia, India, Mexico, Peru, and Brazil, and Pakistan. So there is a little bit of a South American, Central and South America tinge to these ones up here. Maybe 3 of them. Significant ones are Central South America. We see that in the news as well. Brazil as well is one that at least has been accused of not trying very hard. And Brazil certainly is our worst right now. It's got a more than 10% daily growth rate, according to the trend line, and rising. Let's take another look at Brazil. So Brazil is someone else we look at, though they don't seem to have made the conscious decision to not crack down. They've kind of, I might say they've made an unconscious decision not to crack down, just by not thinking too hard about it. It seems like Brazil has effectively done another Sweden. And we're seeing their trend line is not drastically different from Sweden. I mean, it's their percentage is higher, but they're stable. They're not running away with it. They're in this cluster of 6 some countries that are still growing in growing in new cases, but none of them are growing in their growth or are growing their growth rate. None of them are seeing acceleration of growth, so that's good. The trend overall, to me, clearly, squint and you see there is a rope. It's not super frayed. It is below zero as a whole, and nobody is looking terrible here. There are some that are looking really good, like Ecuador. Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken, Ecuador actually was almost at the very bottom, or maybe even off the bottom to begin with, when we first started doing these analyses. And now they've moved up quite a lot in the list. They're in the top 20 for sure. But recently, they're falling in a very nice way. 25% reduction of daily cases. If that keeps happening, they're going to shrink down toward the bottom and disappear. So, for instance, as we saw with South Korea. Other good news, not quite as flashy as Ecuador, but Israel, Netherlands, Portugal, Ireland, and many others, Turkey, Switzerland, that I can't necessarily point to, but most of the countries in this list have the double characteristic. The double whammy is usually what I call it when they're above zero and accelerating, but I don't know. The doubly happy characteristic of being in a shrinking place with their daily growth rate and seeing that shrinkage accelerate. So below zero and trending downward that's more than we need. It's enough to be below zero and flat, actually, to get over the epidemic, like Switzerland here. Below zero and flat, that's fine. Below zero and shrinking is super fine. So, worldwide then, and we can see the peak has happened visibly. This isn't just rope chart peaking. This is peaking in terms of the change in growth. This is the peak of the actual number of cases visibly starting to drop downward worldwide. And we can see this in the rope chart as the world crossed that zero line a couple weeks ago and continues noisily. There are some wild days where it got a 16% growth, or yesterday where it's had a negative 11% growth. Each of these points is an average of 3 days, so it was probably even wilder if we looked at the individual days. But on the whole, entire world, not just the top 25 countries, but all the countries that we have data for, shrinking pretty solidly, 3% trending downward. Great news for the world. I'm not going to spend much time on deaths as usual because they're just so similar to cases and the stuff we get. You get different countries sometimes. Well, not that much different. These really are the same countries. Let's just take a look at Brazil just for fun and Sweden. So the two that there has been news that says, oh, big spike in death in Sweden. And yes, there really are. Averaging 3 days, we have a 64% day-over-day growth in deaths in Sweden. So Sweden is, just for a day, or 3 really, is shooting upwards. But 3 days ago it was fine. It was very good. Had 3 days in a row that was with 30% drop. And so really what we're seeing is this sort of wide band of possibilities, very noisy, plus or minus 30%, but broadly somewhere around zero. A little worse than zero in deaths. Deaths seem to be not only rising but accelerating. So yeah, Sweden as a whole they're kind of holding steady. They're not really losing their grip and heading into the runaway epidemic, but they are not recovering, at least not visibly, not as of this point, not according to the rope chart either. Brazil, Sweden, Sweden, Brazil. And Brazil really is looking kind of bad, as I don't think I pointed this out before. 10% daily growth in new cases and rising. That is bad news for Brazil. Yeah, they're the worst. They're the worst here. Maybe I did point that out. Pakistan. It's rising, but it's not rising super fast. But still, 10% is a lot. You start with 100 cases, and you're 1,000 cases. You got 1,100 and 1,200 plus, and so on. It grows quickly, exponentially. If you're growing 10% every day, or at least polynomially. I don't know. It grows fast. Let's look at testing by country. By the way, the global death rate has turned the corner. turned the corner right around when the global cases turned the corner. Never ceases to amaze me that deaths happen. The death graph matches up time-wise with the cases graph, where you'd expect there to be a delay. But we've talked about that extensively, why that could be. 4% reduction in new deaths worldwide every day. So this is the world recovering. 4% isn't much. We have one really bad day, 33% growth worldwide day over day. That's very high, and that is the average of 3 days, so that makes it kind of even worse. But we do see things like that. We saw something like that there. We saw a really low one 4 days ago, so we don't look at one day and read anything into it. We'll watch if there are 3 days in a row, then we'll start to worry. Looking briefly at all the countries in the world, just to show again how well some of them are testing. Iceland tested 15% of its population. Bahrain, 7%. Luxembourg, 7%. And then there are a few of these: Lithuania, Estonia, Portugal, Israel, this little cluster here that's tested around 4%. And then there's everyone else. The United States, I guess I might have to look at this a little bit differently. So this is supposed to be all the countries, but I don't, oh, there it is. It's just not alphabetical. It was alphabetical for a long time and suddenly decided not to be. All right, great. United States. Obviously something strange happening here with the report of 0 tests, but around 1.8, probably more like 1.9% of the United States tested overall. This should be the same here if we look at it here. Yeah, interesting. We got a couple of missing data points for the United States. But the United States is right in the middle of the pack here. In terms of the top 25 countries, again, there's some countries testing 14%. At least there's one. But then there are the non-outliers, like the major players. And none of the major players are testing at 14%, but Portugal and Israel are doing very well at 4% of their population tested. Italy and Switzerland also doing very well at 3% of their population tested. And then we've got, what is this, Russia, there's something else there, yeah, Russia, Belgium, Canada, and the United States doing pretty well at about 2% tested. We have perfect little clusters around each of the integers here, 3%, 4%, 3%, 2%. And I guess we could say there's sort of a cluster around 1%, and then there are a bunch of them that aren't doing very well at all. I'm not super confident in this data. It comes from ourworldindata.org, but the fact that countries are missing, I think even major countries are missing, testing data just isn't as well reported as some other data. So for the longest time here, I wasn't even showing testing data because it was just so sparse. But now we do have a lot of the major countries. Let's just see, which of the top 5 do we have data for at all? So we don't have it at all for Spain, or we have some weird random points way up there. Italy we have good data for. UK, yes. Germany? Germany. Interesting. I've never seen this particular pattern, but it's clear Germany reports weekly. And so we have a bunch of zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And then there's the 1 week dot, and the 1 week dot, and the 1 week dot. And so this is all the data for each week, which is fine. That works just fine in us seeing the trend. Their trend is as good as anyone, actually, or not as good as the 4%ers, but it puts them in the 3%, that 3% group plus. But the trend line, because there are so many zeros, has decided that 0 is the real trend. So we have to connect the dots ourselves. France also seems to be reporting infrequently. Turkey reports daily. Most of these countries report daily. Iran. So yeah, as we go down this top list, with the maybe single exception of Spain, no, Spain was there, and maybe this probably is true as well. Spain is just maybe only reported twice total. They don't do it weekly, don't do it daily. They just occasionally report. But from what they've reported, we can see that they've tested 2% of their population at least a week ago. So Spain is doing fine also. Canada. Yeah, we have data for almost all the major countries here. All of them, actually. All the top 10. So that's testing. The United States isn't doing too poorly. There are a lot of wild numbers being thrown around about testing 5 million a day or 20 million a day in the United States. That would be great, I guess. But even if we actually look at what they are testing, do we have population is misspelled here. I just added these graphs. I don't have the one that says how much we're testing each day, but if we just look at the difference here, we go from 1.75 to 1.6 with about 0.1%, half of 0.1%. So testing 5 million is more than 1% a day, and right now we're nowhere near that. We've tested 2% over the entire month or month and a half here. So South Korea pulled itself out of this thing with testing at the 0.4% of total population, 0.8% of total population. I believe that any country that tests at 2% is going to be fine. But I also think that there's something to be said for testing at a much higher, very aggressive rate. Give everyone their own home test kit, whatever, just so that you can be extremely sure of who has the virus and open up that much more. So in terms of whether we get over it, we're going to get over it. We're obviously already trending towards getting over it in the United States with no additional testing resources, no change in this trend line. We will get over it. But I think that these wild numbers in the millions a day of testing are an attempt to take a very extreme position on testing so that we can take an extreme position on opening up and say everyone gets to go out in public because we literally have tested every single person in the country, and everyone who's not positive can go out in public, and you all get to retest every day. I don't know, every month everyone retests, and that would certainly put a lid on any sort of resurgence. So the United States, though, is doing fine. It's doing fine. We have not had a great failure of our government if our testing does not improve from here. We're doing fine. All right. Moving on to the states, we already looked at this a little bit. Let's just head to the rope chart. Actually, let's look at the per capita briefly. Oh, I'm going to have to reload this. Let me head back here then while that reloads and see what else we can talk about. I am going to take a quick look at per capita deaths. I guess this is a good reason not to go over deaths, so I can go back to them when my graphs fail. So here again, this has got this landscape view. Look at these rolling golden hills of California in the background here. When we started here, everything was a straight line up and to the right, even accelerating upwards and curving up to the right. And now it looks like we've just got hills in the distance. Everything's peaked, it's coming down. There are exceptions. Ireland, growing in deaths, and this is deaths. This isn't just cases. Sweden, as we've noted, Sweden's looking pretty bad right now in deaths, and is certainly not a rolling golden hill. But the big picture, all the major players are in per capita, they're all looking good. Belgium, interestingly, is the major player per capita in deaths, but it too is a sharp recovery happening here. Now let's go back and see if we can zoom in on our per capita per state. This also has a little bit of the rolling hills of California look going on, which is great. At the state level, most of the major players per capita are solidly recovering. The dominant one, New York, which was all the news a little bit ago, and still, as we saw in that original graph, is still in some sense the dominant news. But when you look per capita, New York is just not that big a deal anymore. It was per capita the biggest one, but now it's recovered and is heading sharply downward. So New York has been passed solidly by Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. As we've seen in other places, Rhode Island seems to be topping off as well. It really looks to me like Massachusetts is topping off. New Jersey has obviously topped off. So all of the top 5 states, the ones with the most cases, are showing this hill look, which indicates their peak is over. things are looking good for all of them. And then there are other ones like Louisiana and Michigan, which though actually I think Michigan might be showing some trouble. We'll see in a minute. But broadly, let's look at Michigan's graph. The picture is one of peak and decline. Now Michigan, we aren't seeing it roll down to this point here. It's sort of flattening back out again. So Michigan actually shows signs just barely on this graph of being in trouble, of indicating that it's going to turn back upwards. These latest 2 data points especially are pulling it upwards again. And I think we're going to see on the rope chart that Michigan actually looks bad in that sense. It's not so visible here, but very visible on the rope chart when something starts to change its trend. This one kind of sticks out for me, Iowa. Yeah, Iowa. So Iowa certainly is not looking like a hill. It's just heading upwards, and a lot of its points are well above the trend line right now. They're just a couple below, and that I think we may also see on the rope chart that Iowa is accelerating. It wasn't even on our radar, our top 25, I think, but it's moved in. I don't know who it's displaced, but Rhode Island is moving down and down, by the way. A small state, but still managed to make the top 25 by having a very extreme. Where is Rhode Island? Yeah, by having a really extreme epidemic, actually. One rivaling New York. It just didn't make the news because Rhode Island is so much smaller, but in its size per capita, Rhode Island's situation has been much like New York's and New Jersey. Let's move on to the rope chart. So this is the growth in new cases day over day. I see a question. Brazil testing. Is growth being limited by testing? Let's look at Brazil. What do we have about Brazil's testing? Population, misspelled again. I gotta get that one fixed. Misspelled in both cases, probably a copy paste. I just added these testing graphs, so gotta do something about that spelling. Yeah, who knows? The answer is who knows. I may have some information about that somewhere, but short answer is we don't have data on Brazil's testing. But the place Brazil's been in the news really is just in being, at least at the highest levels of government, being very blasé about this thing. I think it was Brazil's president or something like that said it was a little flu, and that made a lot of news. And then the president was shown repeatedly walking around and kissing babies and such when everyone else was saying we need to be locking down. So Brazil is, I think, they are doing a Sweden. They're not being as, in Sweden's case, they have what I would say is something of a radical in charge of their infectious disease segment of government, and I forget the guy's name. I can almost see his face, but he just has a different opinion. He went the direction that UK tried to go, of saying we're just not gonna try too hard. We're not gonna make it our top priority to limit infections to the absolute minimum. We'll limit them when we can. We'll try to be reasonable, but we're gonna let ourselves get infected. And I think UK came right out and said it at one point. We're gonna all get infected, and then 2% of us will die, and the other 98% will just be able to live perfectly normal lives, while the rest of the world is in some sort of economic lockdown hell. And so the UK couldn't quite hold that. All their other neighbors pressured them really into behaving themselves. But Sweden has this infectious disease guy who just said, this is what we're going to do. We're sure we'll do a few things. We'll shut down colleges. Sure, we'll even shut down high schools, but we're not going to shut down restaurants. And so I think Brazil is taking it's on the spectrum of reasonable, a position of letting themselves get more infected, letting more people get to the disease. I heard something yesterday, and then I went looking for it and couldn't find it. So take this with a large grain of salt, but I thought I heard that the Swedish government was speculating that 25% of their population was infected. But then I saw some other study that said it was 2%. But if they really do have 25%, that certainly explains the higher death rates they're seeing. But it also means that when you go to a restaurant and sit next to a stranger, there's a 25% chance that they're not going to, they can't infect you. There's a 25% chance that you can't infect them. And so even without herd immunity, there's a way that that sort of approach can flatten the curve eventually. So anyway, Brazil, we don't have the testing numbers for, but was I really in, what am I doing here on this tab? Somehow I ended up in the counties. We don't have the testing numbers for Brazil, so I'll see if I can find that, but it hasn't. They're not reporting them, and that may just be another example of their government not taking the epidemic very seriously. I'm sure they're testing. I'm sure they have tests, but they just may not have set up a governmental process for reporting tests because they don't care so much. They're just going to go live their lives and see what happens. And the scientists among us say, great. We like having controlled studies, and you can only have a controlled study if someone does something different from everything else, differently from everyone else. That's Brazil, and that's Sweden, and that's also Georgia, by the way. All right, now I've really lost my train of thought. We were talking about, yes, all these nice hills, all the rolling hills. So the states on this graph, looking good states. There are some of them not so good. I think I pointed Iowa has just started to creep up, and we'll look at the rope chart to see more about who are the real creeps here. But really, it's looking pretty good from that graph. Now you look at this one, it's not quite so good. This is kind of the opposite. When I started all this, I was saying, well, this graph looks terrible because it was all up and to the right, but look what I see coming. All these nice lines heading downward, everything's going to be great. Today, there's still a sense that we may be turning the wrong corner at this point, or we may be turning back around the corner. Obviously, this nice downward trend we saw into mid-April has evaporated. If that had continued, we'd all be at negative 10%. All the states would be shrinking 10% every day. That's not happening. We do have a lot of states that are shrinking, but none of them are shrinking at 10%. New York, even the poster child for recovery, is shrinking at a mere 8% a day and accelerating. So New York's doing great. And there are a bunch of others: New Jersey, Rhode Island, Ohio, Connecticut, Florida, Missouri, Massachusetts. These are all currently success stories. All it takes is a few days of very different data for these lines to curve and head back the other way. Like, for instance, Louisiana is, after showing such a nice recovery, it's now headed back towards zero, but it's still shrinking. It's still below zero. It's just that the second level of it says, well, it's nice that you're shrinking, but you're also losing momentum. And so Louisiana is losing momentum, but at least they're going in the right direction. Pennsylvania is doing pretty well. Tennessee doing quite well. Small shrinkages every day, but accelerating. Texas barely holding it together with a 1% drop each day and very slightly accelerating. And right on the line here, Arizona, which is just turning the corner now, but is turning the corner. It is heading downward in a nice way. So those are almost all these are downward, are headed in the. They are already below zero, and they're headed in even further below zero. So that's all great news, except for Louisiana, which is still okay, but is looking troublesome. On the other hand, though, we've got Colorado and Michigan, which are by far the worst. These are doing exactly what we hate. Colorado and Michigan are seeing more than 10% daily growth, and their growth is accelerating. Let's look at Colorado a little more closely. Cases per million in Colorado. So Colorado is very noisy at this point. We've got a lot of zeros here where they haven't reported at all. We've got a bunch of really high numbers where they actually have probably reported 2 days at once, 2 days at once. I don't know, this one seems to be real because it follows a real day, 2 days at once. But even with those 2 days at once numbers ending up maybe around here somewhere, we still see this slight upward trend. In the most recent days, it's really hard to say because they're giving us they're not giving us good data here. We're not getting good data for Colorado. If we have to mentally adjust so many things. If you average this point and this point, then we end up with one that's somewhere near this point. You average this point and this point, we end up with one that's right around this point. And we see like it seems like there's a trend going right below the line here. Average this point and this point, you get something near the cross to the right, lower, below this, near the 50 line. Also below the trend line. Then this is on the trend line, this is below the trend line, this is above the trend line. If I had to guess, I would say this trend line is too high. But because we have these wild ups and downs, I do think that really makes this line suspect. It's hard for, this line again is trying to guess the growth rates. I mean, whether the growth rates are generally going up or down. And when you have 0 all of a sudden, that's sort of an infinite drop of growth rate, and then the next day goes up to wherever, and that's an infinite rise of growth rate. Fortunately, we are averaging them, so we don't actually get the infinities here, but still, that kind of swings, those kinds of swings, which are purely data swings, it's clearly not real-world swings, are making for some extreme numbers here. Did Colorado really see a 35% reduction of new cases, and then a 35% increase of new cases? No, they didn't. So I'm just going to hope that I'm going to sort of point to this and say we don't know what's happening in Colorado. The news doesn't look great from what we see here, but you could make a back of the envelope argument that Colorado is something like stable right along this line. In spite of all these, it's something like stable, maybe going up a little bit. It really doesn't show signs of dropping at this point, but is it the worst in the country? Maybe not. So here's hoping that the Colorado data points start coming in more reliably. We have 4 in a row now, so that's good. And once they do, this curve will also be more reliable, and we'll be able to say what's really happening in Colorado. Michigan, however, I think is probably more real. Michigan. Why can't I find Michigan? There it is. You know, you look at this and does this look bad to you? To me, it looks like it peaked and it's dropping, and so there are certainly there are a few recent days where it seems to have gone up and seems to have gone up, but I'm more inclined to call that noise. So actually, there again, Michigan's trend line, which isn't terrible, 10% and accelerating is bad, but not terrible. I'm not sure I believe it. It's 1 point, as I've said, can be a fluke. 2 points can be a coincidence. When you start getting 3, it starts to be a habit. We don't quite have 3 here. We have 2 pretty bad points for Michigan, and the trend line is accepting them as evidence of upwards acceleration. Now, I've sometimes seen these trend lines do better than I do. It may be worth taking a really deep dive in here just to show what these really do. So you can, because I look at this and I say, well, this doesn't match what we're seeing in the previous graph at all. It says it's a 30% increase, and the previous day was a 30%. It was also a 30% increase. So what do we have here? Let's just take one of these. These 3 points. Put those 3 together. There are 2 high ones and a low one. So it ends up being maybe a little bit above the line. You average the 2 high ones and a low one, you get 1 point above the line. You take the day before that, and you have 2 low ones and a high one, because we're taking 3 points at a time. 2 low ones and a high one, and so you end up a point a little bit below the line. And so it is plausible that when you look at, or it's not just plausible, what actually happens is it takes the last 3 points and says, that's our latest day, that's kind of high. It takes the previous 3 points, or not it takes this point, and this point, and says that's pretty low because there are 2 low ones, and so that's sort of a maybe right on the trend line or a little below it, and then it takes these 3 points and says, well, that's really low, so that's our 3rd day, and we end up with this series of 3 rising points, which is why we have 2 rises. From the 3rd day, it went up 30%, and 30 the 2nd day ago, and from the 2nd day to 1 day ago, it went up 27%. But when you look at this, is that real? Well, that's it's how the analysis works, and one way we could mitigate this is by going to, say, an average of 4, which would reduce the amount of sort of spurious. We'd just be averaging more days. So when you got noise like this, it would tend to be leveled out even more. At this point, I'm relying on my, first of all, the averaging to mitigate some of that sort of problem. And then I'm relying on the way the trend line does another level of averaging to further mitigate that sort of problem. But still, you can get cases like Michigan here, where I would say a squinty look at this would say this is actually heading downward, not just this line, which certainly is heading downward, but it's not even really showing a sign of accelerating upwards. We do see 3 low days and then 2 high days, but then there are those 2 high days back there and some low days back there, and overall we can just look at this as a pretty noisy, steadily downward line. But that's not how it works when we're looking at this kind of 3-day granularity. We end up with these sorts of anomalies, which are really due more to noise than anything else. So in both of our trouble spots, we've looked at them both somewhat closely. They're not quite as troubling as the graph initially says. And we will see this as the next day comes. It'll be, if it's up, if the next day is right here in Michigan, then we'll have another confirmation of the upward path. And then we might start to say, yeah, that really is curving upwards. If there's another day upwards, then again we have confirmation. Again, we might say, yeah, that's curving upwards. But if it's low, then this will just evaporate. Michigan and Colorado could totally rejoin the pack in 1 or 2 days, and this will have been nothing but a random swing of the data. So, limitation of this analysis, because I'm looking at such a short time period, we do see more random swings where things suddenly look really good or really bad. But in the long term, we still get to see the trends. So we tend to see more fraying at the end of the rope. This is also the way that New York analyzes its data. So when I doubt myself for doing it this way, I think, well, New York does an average of 3 days too and reports it. And so if the smart people of New York who have managed to do this with their trend line are doing an analysis similarly to this, then it can't be that bad. So the big picture here then is states, about half, less than half maybe, are up and trending, trending higher, or not trending higher. Really only these 2 are solidly trending higher, and we actually doubt those 2. New York, I don't think there's any reason to doubt that its trend is low from what we've seen on the graphs. And all of these, some of these may be a little in doubt as well. Again, they swing based on random noise in the data, but the general trend here is that a lot of the states, all of them except for Louisiana, are below zero. Half of them are below zero and trending downward. The rest are not doing exactly what we want because they're above zero, but at least they're mostly flat. The sole exception being Washington State, which oddly continues its trend of growth. I just keep saying we're going to keep an eye on Washington. It shows the potential of seeing a second wave here. It really got over it. It was way down here for a while, way below everyone else, and now it's showing a trend back towards accelerating growth. So I don't know what's going on in Washington State, but at least they have excess infrastructure to cope with it. All right, I'm way behind schedule. Let's just look really quickly a little more at the states. Rhode Island continues to dominate in testing. New York and Massachusetts and Louisiana also doing well in testing. California, well, it seems to be picking up a little bit. Do we have that California trend? Yeah, so in the number of the percent that's being tested each day, I actually changed this graph today to show percent so that it matches the scale on the other graph. What percent is California testing each day? Well, they're testing 6 or 7 hundredths of a percent. So in 15 days or something, they can test 1%, and this is how they've gradually gotten themselves up to wherever they are, 2%, maybe 1.5%. California continues to do poorly. Recall that there's talk of testing 5 million people a day or even more nationwide, which would be testing more than 1% of the population of the United States every single day. And you can see how far we are from that in California, where we'd have to have a 20-fold increase in our testing rate. Rhode Island, however, Rhode Island is testing 0.25% every single day. Every day they test 0.25%. So they'd only have to go 4 times faster to get to this something analogous to that 5 million number. Still that would be an extraordinary level of testing. And even Rhode Island, which is dominating the United States right now, is far behind that. Let's go quickly to the counties of California. That Los Angeles, as always, dominating. Let's look at it, though. Per capita, we see Imperial still way above everyone else per capita. Los Angeles is close behind. We are not seeing the rolling hills of California on this California graph so much. We're not seeing peaks and falling off. Los Angeles, for a while, looked like it was headed there, but then it just blew up. Yeah, I lost my lines on this graph. It's all right, I'm running out of time anyway. Los Angeles does not seem to be getting better right now. One good possible reason there, and this is kind of in line with Isaac's question about Brazil, is Brazil's is the growth of Brazil limited by testing, and not the growth of infection, therefore, but the growth of reported cases? Well, sure. I think that in almost everywhere, the reported cases have been limited by testing. You can only report what we know. And so, and we've only been able to test people with symptoms so far. We've had to carefully restrict our testing to the people who needed it most. Healthcare professionals regularly tested, people with symptoms tested, etc., etc. So, Brazil, if their testing infrastructure is limited, they could have vastly more cases than we know about. There was some sense this might have happened in Russia. Nice news about Los Angeles is their testing infrastructure is no longer limited in that way. They are actually the first place, I guess Iceland, but the first place in the United States that I've heard of that is publicly saying we have more tests than we know what to do with. And in fact, they're saying, please come in and take a free test. Los Angeles has free drive-through testing now because they set up testing and they, at the end of the day, had tests left over from the people who really needed it. So now they're saying, all right, we don't care if you need it. Come in and test. If I lived in LA, I'd be tested right now. And I encourage anyone who lives in LA to go get tested. Why not? Find out if you're one of those people who needs to be contact traced or needs to start, I don't know, whatever that new drug is. Remdesivir or something. So Los Angeles is on the cutting edge now, in some sense, in testing, in a very good way. They're testing so many people that they actually have the capacity to test people who don't obviously need it. And so maybe that's why Los Angeles has so many cases, is because they're testing everyone who possibly could need it. And the tests come back in 24 hours or maybe 48 hours. So that's my hope, is that Los Angeles, this is really just what the whole world would look like if everyone could test at full capacity. That we would see a spike as all the cases were found, and then we'd see a drop as all the contacts were traced and all the cases were quarantined and so on. So Los Angeles looks bad on paper, but especially given that news about free testing and excess testing capacity, oh no. Given that news, I should do this before I start talking. I can rant on for 20 seconds and that was really fast. Great. My things reload. Okay, quickly to the rope chart. Come on, rope chart. Good. Worked. Rope chart doesn't look so good for California. It's not terrible, but it's frayed. We saw this a couple weeks ago, really. A chart much like this. It seems like we're kind of treading water in California. There are counties that are doing really well and counties that are doing really poorly. Tulare, randomly, is now has this 23% growth rate and accelerating. San Luis Obispo, the same. Solano, also 10% growth rate, accelerating. Stanislaus, San Diego. Some of these are pretty big counties. Orange. Those are the bad news. Those six. I guess the rest of the news is good. You have a lot that are slightly growing, but none of them are accelerating, except, well, a couple of them are. Ventura and Shasta are turning the corner in the wrong direction and heading back towards positive growth. So the news isn't bad there yet. It might just be a blip, but definitely something to be worried about. And then there's a whole cluster of San Mateo, Kern, San Bernardino, Marin, etc., that have all these, they have just a very slight growth rate. They're really kind of stable in their new cases, same number of new cases every day, but they're not getting any better. So again, we could hope it's because the testing infrastructure is coming online to the point that as maybe their infections are dropping, but at the same time the tests are rising, and so we see competing forces appearing to show equilibrium, where there really is no equilibrium in the population, where the infections are actually dropping. We hope. We don't know. If so, then once testing capacity reaches excess there as well, we'll start to see the downward trend appearing there. And we do see downward trends in quite a lot of places. San Francisco, which was kind of in bad shape just a couple weeks ago, is now the very best, and that's Contra Costa. Well, San Francisco has a great day, but it's really not here. It had a really good day, but actually I don't think that... Okay, San Francisco, yeah, it was in bad shape a couple weeks ago. It is not the best, however, but it has barely turned the corner back again to negative growth, and it's just had a really great day. Not enough to make a trend out of, but we'll watch that one. Contra Costa is the one that I thought was the really good one. It is the really good one. Contra Costa, San Joaquin, Santa Barbara, Monterey, few cases, so not necessarily believe that trend line too much. And Los Angeles, which as we keep seeing, well, yeah, let's look at Los Angeles. This is another place where you say, but wasn't Los Angeles looking terrible? So it does have this mini trend line downward. And that's what our rope chart is picking up and saying, hey, it looks like Los Angeles is kind of swooping over here and heading downward. When you actually look at the differences in the growth day by day, there are a whole lot of downward growth in a lot of recent days, and only one spectacular upward growth where suddenly we had this really bad point. So Los Angeles, if we look at the total graph, I think, yeah, we'll see as there's a mini trend downward, we get a bunch of points below zero, because those points just say what was the growth rate day to day. And so any sort of a mini trend like this downward, we see a lot of negative, which tends to pull this line downward and say, oh yeah, we're seeing negative growth. You see one really bad day like that, and it, at least to my eye, it really makes me suspect this trend line here is reasonable. We really are headed upwards. But maybe correctly, our trend line here is not going to believe that one extreme growth day. It's going to say that's just one day. Really, Los Angeles is heading downward and things are fine. So we have two competing stories here. One is that Los Angeles has a lot of high new cases, and the other is that we're actually seeing a peak here and a swoop downward and a single outlier. There again, we'll just keep watching. We'll see. If we have two more of these, then we can really start saying, wow, that's terrible. And that's where we'll start to see this thing cross above zero again. So Los Angeles, good news, bad news. You be the judge. Okay, I'm way over time. I'll just look briefly at the testing. Again, California does poorly in testing. It's been doing poorly in testing, though I guess it's good news that at least one place, Los Angeles, has now an excess of testing. So if they can do it, maybe everyone can do it, and we'll get to the point where we're doing what Iceland is doing, where you just test everyone. You don't need to have a sniffle, just come get a test, it's free. Los Angeles is already doing that, and if we see that throughout the state, then I think a lot of people, if only driven by fear, are going to be showing up and getting those tests. And then we'll suddenly have 10% of the population tested. Could happen. But the very best testing is happening in Riverside and San Francisco, 1.8% of the population total. Not very huge. Again, nothing like this approximately 1% daily that we're seeing thrown around. I've even heard 20 million a day, which would be something like 5% of the whole country gets tested every day. It's certainly possible to build up infrastructure like that. Very expensive, don't know if it's worth it. But 2% total over months It doesn't seem like enough to me. It seems like, and those are the best ones. I like what Rhode Island's doing. I like what Iceland's doing. I'd like to see us doing something more in line with that. And now it looks like Los Angeles, you can see Los Angeles is cutting across all these other lines, which means it's testing faster and faster. Its speed of ramping up its testing is greater than everyone else, and so that apparently is how they've managed to do this magic thing where everyone gets tested for free. Residents only, by the way. Don't fly to Los Angeles just to get a test. It'll spread elsewhere eventually. I'm not sure that free testing for all will become a nationwide thing, but I bet there will be some other places that will do that. I believe South Korea did. That's the news for today. So the county news not looking quite as good. I guess if I had to take a very squinty look at this, I'd say it's headed downward overall. But there certainly is there are a lot of counties bucking the trend, and a lot of counties bucking the trend slightly, and then quite a few bucking them pretty hard. On the U.S. states level, yeah, kind of similar. The rope's frayed. This is not as good as the news even was yesterday, I don't think. It's really kind of mixed. The states are about centered around that zero line. It's not obvious that the states are heading towards recovery, but when we do look at the United States as a whole, it does indicate that it's headed towards recovery, so probably they are. It's just that the bigger ones are recovering and the smaller ones are getting worse, and so on average the country moves in the right direction. And once the small ones get over their epidemics, then everyone will be below zero. And then again, as always, at the country level of countries, we're seeing what's definitely a below zero average and a downward trend for the most part. So the bigger it gets, the better the news gets. News isn't as good today at the state and county level as it was yesterday. We'll see how it is tomorrow. Now, I did say I wasn't going to be doing one today at all, and then I did. It turns out that my travel plans for today are evening plans, so I did not. I normally do this at 1 o'clock, and I was able to anyway. So that's the news. I will probably be back tomorrow. It seems like every day has new exciting changes, and I'm interested to see especially how Los Angeles is going to do as we go forward now that they're testing everyone for free. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.